So now we have an extensive knowledge, an extensive historical backdrop of the American Revolution. And usually historians like to categorize the next period that follows the American Revolution as, quote, the early national period, unquote. And really, the word to focus on here is the term national. Let me remind you that in July 4th, 1776, it could have easily been the case that you have no United States of America, so to speak, right? United States. You could have had, in other words, 13 separate nation states, if you will. But that's not what we happened. We kept it a nation comprised of states. And as we discussed, that necessitated the formation of a central government. And at first, it was deliberately weak insofar as it didn't have a lot of powers. And then we talk about how the new Constitution, ratified in 1789, significantly enlarged the powers of the government. So, this period following, again, refers to this early national period. And here's the thing about the nation in the very beginning. And by the way, before I discuss this, if you look at this illustration, it's a well known one whereby you see American settlers constantly moving west. And as they move west, they also bring with them American ideals like freedom and equality and democracy. In fact, this is what the figure represents here. This is Lady Liberty, if you will. And in her clutches is the Constitution, perhaps even our founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So the whole notion here is that where Americans go, so too do they bring their quote unquote secular religion with them. That is, freedom and democracy. Another way to phrase this is a well known slogan, kind of cult, or it goes like this: the Constitution follows the flag, quote unquote. All right. So again, where Americans go, we bring with us our founding beliefs. And this is true whether back then in the early national period, as we see westward movement and expansion of this newly formed nation, or even today in our involvement in the larger global world. Okay, so going back to this idea of nation newly formed after 1789, one thing we have to remember is this: that the United States of America at this time, that is to say, following the ratification of the Constitution, is very fluid and lacks definition. Okay, it's ill defined, if not undefined, in some areas. In fact, even geographically, you can make that argument that it's not definitively defined. Why? Because there were some states that did not have clearly demarcated western borders that they established. So if you put all states together at that time, you can't even determine where the western boundaries of this new nation was. Right. So it's clearly undefined in terms of geographic expression, but in many other ways that's true as well. And if you look at the bullet that's first listed here, it is referring to a fluid or undefined idea of national identity. Here's the thing: we remarked on the fact that during the Articles of Confederation, most people tended to identify first with their given state and then perhaps nation, secondly, or even thirdly, perhaps, right? That is to say, if you're from Virginia, you tend to think I'm a Virginian first and an American second, right? And this is in keeping with this whole idea of this distrust that's cast towards a central government, right, or the larger nation as a whole. Now, again, the Constitution enlarges the powers and solidifies the nation, but even when we meditate on the idea of what is American or what does that mean, it's still rather amorphous, it's ill-defined. Let's remember that half of the population in, say, 1789 or 1790 was not even um, of English origin. The term they used back then was, quote, Anglo-Saxon, right? So, in other words, it's rather heterogeneous, ethnically speaking. Um, this again was originally English settlement, like we talked about, right? In New England, in the experimental colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland, in Virginia, the Chesapeake region. It was practically all English, settlement coming from the New World. Now we have this interesting mix, and began this discussion with, let's say, the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Scots Irish, and even the French Huguenots coming over during the 18th century. But this remains true in 1790, of course. In fact, you have more immigrants coming from Europe. For example, Scandinavians, more French, and so on and so forth. Okay, eventually you're going to see Irish coming in by, let's say, the 1820s, 1830s. So if you ask the question, who is American, it's hard to answer that. In fact, Congress is now tasked with the duty of defining what is American in terms of naturalization. That is to say, immigrants who could be naturalized as citizens, right? If you recall, during the enumerated powers, of the Constitution, it lists all those powers that Congress now has. And their first attempt to do such in terms of legislation was the Naturalization Act of 1790. That's merely 1 year after, the Constitution was ratified. And it defined citizens as, quote, white, and secondly, as free. Now, again, when we use the word white, you definitely can't think of it the same way we use it today because it meant something different. In fact, back then, basically, it meant Anglo Saxon, perhaps Northern Europeans, like Germanic speaking people, right? Certainly, if there was virtually no Mediterranean Europeans coming over at that time, but if you were, let's say, from Italy and you came over to the United States, you would not be considered white. In fact, the Irish were not considered white. Okay, I know that sounds confusing because we think of white, quote unquote, the way we do today, Caucasian white, as opposed to other ethnic groups. And by the way, the fact that it's so much in flux, right, it fluctuates so much, is again a reminder to us that race is a social construction. It depends how it's defined in that particular era in history. Okay, so it's, in other words, hard to define who is, quote, American in terms of national identity in light of all the ethnic heterogeneity that characterize demographically what's happening during the early national period. Moreover, you see conflicting ideas of republicanism. And here, let me alert you to one thing. This debate between Jefferson and Hamilton is really directed towards what you could call political economy. All right, political economy. And the most basic way to think about political economy is just to think of the relationship between, let's say, a given nation's politics, political institutions, and its economic institutions, right? So think of that interconnection. In a basic sense, that's what political economy refers to. So what emerges here, and again, let me remind you, it's not established for this new nation in terms of its political economy. Why? Because the Articles of Confederation, again, as a reminder, had no power to establish it, right? They could not, in other words, form a national economy. They could not even facilitate such a thing as interstate commerce. Why? Because, it was thought that that'd be too much power given to this central government called the Articles of Confederation. Now, in our list of enumerated powers, again, in Article 1, Section 8 that we looked over in the Constitution, the formation of a national economy is definitely there as a power vested onto Congress. Now, at this time, you see uh, a party in charge, and they're called the Federalist Party. And the Federalists were around before the Constitution, or right before it, right? Uh, and they were basically in support of ratifying the Constitution, let's say in 1789. So obviously, people like Madison and Hamilton and Washington are Federalists. Now, Washington, as we know, is elected our first president with the ratification of the Constitution, and he appoints Alexander Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary. What does this mean? It means that Hamilton is going to be charged with the task of trying to set this new nation, which now has the power to establish a national economy, onto a particular economic direction. And what does Hamilton believe in? Well, Hamilton is, by the way, a great admirer of the English Empire, and he certainly noticed that in England at this time, during the late 1700s and early 1800s to be exact, England was undergoing something called an industrial revolution. And we'll talk about more about the Industrial Revolution in our next topic, the Jacksonian period. But for now, just think of industrialization as the next phase in the development of economics, right? Where you leave behind agrarianism and you leave behind a small farmer with a small family farm, and it's replaced by what? It's replaced by factories, right? And factory workers and wage workers, right? Employees, not agrarian farm workers. Okay, but Hamilton is taking note of this in England, and uh, here is Hamilton's view in terms of political economy, and we'll discuss how this diverges from Jefferson. All right, so Hamilton, again, being this Anglophile, and also being this visionary, really, that this new nation should pursue commercialism and early industrialization, right? So that's his agenda. He's going to, as the Secretary of Treasury, establish this, a path towards achieving this economic goal. All right. So Hamilton here, again, just to repeat, advocates commercialism. He feels that this new nation should be following the example of England and pursue, business, commercialism, early industrialization, right? In fact, he saw this new nation as comprised fundamentally as business persons, right? Not the farmer, right? But as business persons. This is how we think today, actually, right? I'm sure none of those who are listening to this are farmers by trade, right? Because that agrarian age is over in terms of being the primary, if you will, person in that economy or labor. So Hamilton is still thinking during the agrarian age, however, right? Where everything is profoundly agrarian. And in this way, he is a visionary. He's seeing that the way it's going to be in the future is commerce, right? And eventually it will replace agrarianism. Therefore, he sort of ascribes this exalted status upon business and business people, right? And in the process, he's also supporting this idea of, large federal government. Why? Because, of course, he's in a position, a supremely important position here, right, as the Treasury Secretary. And because of that, he feels that the federal government that's newly established has to play a crucial and central role, again, in trying to pursue commercialism, right? Now, that's Hamilton's view regarding, political economy. But again, this is opposed by some people who are not as visionary as Hamilton. Let's put it that way, Okay. And again, the backdrop is this: it's not defined in terms of what this new republic should pursue economically. So, in a way, this is a debate that's really emerging. And the person who really opposed Hamilton, was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who'd become our third president later. But Jefferson, as opposed to Hamilton, really believes that this new republic should be agrarian based. And who he puts on a pedestal, so to say, right? Who he exalts here um, is not the business person, but what you could call the independent yeoman farmer. Okay, we talked about yeoman farmers before. In case slipped your memory, it's spelled Yeoman, right? A yeoman farmer. And yeoman farmers are basically small farmers, and they did own their land. Okay, they're not squatters on someone else's land. So why did Jefferson believe that this should be an agrarian-based republic fundamentally comprised by that independent yeoman farmer? It's this. It goes back to our earlier discussion of that relation between the English meaning of land and political independence. So let me jog your memory here, just in case you don't recall it. It was believed in England that if you owned your own land, that means you're truly independent. Why? Because you don't depend on anyone else for your own survival in the world. Okay, and again, you have to remember this is the world being predominantly agricultural and agrarian, right? You don't have, in other words, department stores where you could go and buy your stuff. No, it comes from the land, right? So it's fundamental. Um, so this is opposed to those who didn't own land. That means, yeah, they still have to use the land, but they're squatting on that land. And remember, we talked about the enclosure movement a while back, right? When they were kicked off the land. But still, if you're a squatter, you don't own land and you squat someone else's land who has the title of it, right? The Lord, if you will. And you're paying that person rent and some taxes to do that. But when you really examine your position in relation to the person who you could call a quote landowner or landholder, unquote, you're in a dependency relation. You depend on that landholder for your own survival in the world, your own sustenance of you and your family. Okay, so you're not really free, you are dependent. And that's again opposed to someone who does own land. They are not dependent, rather, it's the opposite. They are independent. And this translated into the political sphere where only independent people, therefore free people, right? If you're independent, you're free. Only those people could participate in political affairs. All right, so Jefferson still inherits this view. He presupposes it, right? He assumes it's still the way the world is, and you can't fault him for that because practically everyone thought that way. So Jefferson, therefore, as I mentioned, believes this new republic should be fundamentally comprised of independent yeoman farmers. Why? Again, it's because if it's comprised of yeoman farmers who are independent, who own their land, that means everyone's free, right? Because they do own their land. They're not squatters and therefore immersed in a dependency relation. They're actually independent and free. So what you have here is a republic of free people who all own their land. Now, in this way of thinking, he definitely retains that distrust towards this enlarged government, right? And that's opposed to Hamilton, who felt, of course, that that large government should be used to pursue commercialism. So hopefully you can see now the divergent opinions of Jefferson, who advocates the pursuit of, or the continued pursuit, I should say, of agrarianism versus Hamilton, who supports this new uh, approach of being predominantly commercial. So that's the fluid sort of and undefined economic situation happening. Even government itself was fluid. Okay. Uh, in the beginning of the Constitution, today we have our senators or our congresspersons attending, sessions and meetings in Washington, D.C. Well, in the beginning, that didn't happen, right? You had very little attendance. The delegates still put their states before the federal government. And not only was it low in participation, they still had to establish, certain precedents. If you're not familiar with that term, it's spelled Precedent. And basically, a precedent is something that serves as a guide for future cases, right? A guiding example. So there's no precedent set in terms of this government. It's very fluid, right? Even minor things like how do we address the president, right? There's no precedent for that. So one person actually suggested this. We should address the president as, quote, Your Highness, Protector of the Liberties, right? And when that went around for a vote, they said, nah, that sounds too much like a monarchy, right? Especially when you use the word Your Highness, like you're looking up at this person because they're naturally above you. Well, not in our horizontal scheme, right? It's not vertical, it's horizontal where we see eye to eye. So they just said, okay, let's just say Mr. President instead. And we still use that today, all right? So things like that, precedents are going to be set. Now, here's the way to think about what's happening. And this includes not only things like government, but also the new nation as a whole. During this period, as we know, it's an undefined nation. There's still a lot of unprecedented, things about our government, right? So the way you have to think, or not only our government, but practically all aspects. So the way you have to think about this is this. The new nation as a whole, whether government, whether it's economics, whether national identity, not to mention other realms, is that this new nation is a blank slate. And what needs to happen is, content and substance has to be filled in this blank slate. So this is the best way to think about it. And usually when you actually provide substance and content, what is doing this is to our earlier term as precedent, right? You establish precedents. And once you establish these precedents, again, these are governing examples, right, for the future. Well, you're providing more content into this blank slate, and the blank slate becomes less and less blank, right, and more replete with content. So, as we continue our discussion of the early national period and actually spilling over into ensuing periods following, well, you have to think about that. Think about this new nation being filled in with content. And whenever we talk about precedents, right, which we will quite a bit, think of it as content. So we'll now move to the next slide.